Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. This episode of Future Squared is brought to you by Spigot, the largest provider of innovation management software to some of the world's foremost companies, including the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Westpac, CSIRO, Westfield, AT&T, Citi, Coca-Cola, MetLife Insurance, Pfizer, Sprint, Unilever, and many more. Spigot has powered innovation and process improvement for large enterprises, enabling them to engage with their employees, customers, and partners to build a culture of innovation. Spigot is recognized by both Gartner and Forrester as the leader in the innovation management sector. For a limited time, listeners of Future Squared can get 10% of Spigot's innovation management platform. Taking advantage of this offer is super easy. Simply sign up for a demo at futuresquared.xyz/Spigot. That's SPIGIT. And now for today's episode. Today I'll be speaking with Alec Ross. He's one of America's leading experts on innovation. He's currently a distinguished visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Industries of the Future. The Industries of the Future explores the technological and economic trends and developments that will shape the next 10 years, from cybersecurity and big data, to the commercialization of genomics, to the codification of money, markets, and trust. Alec Ross recently served for 4 years as Senior Advisor for Innovation to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, a role created for him by Secretary Clinton to maximize the potential of technology and innovation in service of America's diplomatic agenda. In this role, Alec acted as a diplomatic lead on a range of issues including cybersecurity, internet freedom, disaster response, and the use of network technologies in conflict zones. Previously, Alec served as a convener for the Technology, Media and Telecommunications Policy Committee on Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign and served on the Obama-Biden presidential transition team. Alec has received countless accolades, including Oxford University's Internet and Society Award, Forbes' Top 10 Technology Reads of 2016, the US Department of State's Distinguished Honor Award, Huffington Post's 10 Game Changers in Politics Award, and the Tribeca Film Festival Disruptive Innovation Award. I was super excited to speak with Alex, having read his book countless times and listened to the audiobook version of it countless times more. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to introduce you to the one, the only, Alec Ross. Welcome to the show, Alec.
Thanks for having me.
So you're joining us all the way from Baltimore, Maryland?
Yeah, I have a feeling that if you dug a hole and just kept digging straight down and came out on the other side of the earth, you'd probably show up in my backyard.
Possibly. We might have to test that theory after we're done recording this episode.
There you go. Yeah. It's good to talk to you using the wonders of modern technology.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's something we would have found a lot more difficult going back just 15 or 20 years. And something that I think I am always eternally grateful just growing up and being alive in this time when we can connect in such an easy manner. So it's been about a year since Industries of the Future, your critically acclaimed book, which made Forbes' Top 10 Technology Reads of 2016, came out. What's been keeping you busy since the release of the book, Alec?
Oh, goodness gracious. Well, I'll tell you what, the book itself is coming out in 18 languages. Mm-hmm. So, I've been moving all around the world as it's been coming out in different languages. It's better to have good timing than be smart, I've learned. And the content of the book, I guess, is very well timed to what's shaping the world. I'm also spending a significant amount of my time with startups. I've got a
Hmm.
little portfolio of 7 very fast-growing technology companies that I'm working with in the United States.
Hmm.
And last but not least, I'm at Johns Hopkins, a terrific institution, and helping to do some teaching and shape how that university is approaching entrepreneurship and innovation.
Hmm. Fantastic. And I love what you said there about timing being more important than being smart, which kind of aligns with what people say about luck. It's just the intersection of hard work and timing sometimes. But you've touched on a few things there around your role with a few emerging startups and your role at Johns Hopkins University. I mean, you've enjoyed quite the decorated career, culminating with a 4-year stint as senior innovation advisor to Hillary Clinton while she was Secretary of State, and you had that role from 2009 to 2013, a role I understand was created specifically for you. So, for the benefit of our audience who may not be familiar with you or your work, perhaps give us the 2,000-foot view of your career trajectory leading up to your gig with the US Department of State, penning and releasing Industries of the Future, and now taking these roles with a handful of startups and your role at Johns Hopkins.
Sure, and I'll start at the end, which is for those of you who heard that I was senior advisor for innovation to Hillary Clinton. I'll just answer the first question right off. No, I did not innovate her email. That nice little piece of work was done before I got there. Look, I grew up in coal country in the United States in a state called West Virginia.
Hmm.
It's very much sort of the caricature of a coal country. Very low income. You know, most of the work done by men with big shoulders, pulling dark stuff out of the earth, which has not been an especially productive thing to be doing over the past many decades. And so my career in West Virginia actually began working as a midnight janitor. It was my job to mop up the aftermath of country music concerts in coal country. And let me tell you, it was not pretty. And then, from there, I took a step up in the world. I worked on a beer truck.
Hmm.
Uh,
That's a big step up.
and it is a big step up. Delivering beer is more pleasant than mopping up whiskey smelling puke after a
Yeah.
country music concert. But it's still tough. I mean, there were places that we would deliver beer to, and I'll never forget my first day on the job. The truck driver said to me, he goes, there are certain bars we'll only deliver to before noon. And
Hmm.
I couldn't understand why. But I figured out pretty quickly when it, began delivering to these bars at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the morning, and the bars are completely full, and everybody at the bar has 3 things in front of them on
Hmm.
the bar: a shot of whiskey,
Hmm.
a, a can of beer,
Uh-huh.
or a draft of beer, and their gun.
Wow.
Um, so it's tough area. From there, I did this when I was in university, so I had to work my tail off to get myself through university. But after that, I began teaching. I joined a program called Teach for America,
Hmm.
which takes new university students who've done well in university and puts them into poor communities to teach in. And even though I grew up amidst rural poverty, and then taught in an environment of urban poverty. I taught in West Baltimore during the crack cocaine wars of the 1990s. So if you think back to a lot of the sort of gangster movies from the 1990s,
Hmm.
that is the environment that I'm working in. I did that for a handful of years, wonderfully rewarding work, though very, very difficult,
Hmm.
really hard. I mean, I'd have 35, 40 students in these tiny little classrooms, kids who would come to class, hungry and angry.
Yeah.
And from that, I decided that, while I could do what I could do over the course of one school year with, 30, 35 students in a classroom, what I ultimately thought uh, was where I could make the biggest impact was on systems. Like, how do we change the systems
Hmm.
such that people growing up in rural West Virginia or urban Baltimore can live better lives? And so I started a company in a basement. This is now in 2000. This is 17 years ago.
Hmm.
The purpose of which was to bring technology tools into the homes of low income people. And it was started by me and three buddies. You know, it was four of us down in a basement with half an idea and no money. And we grew that organization into becoming a global organization with programs on four continents, helping millions of low income people get access to technology, technology training, and technology jobs. Uh, Barack Obama noticed me back then. You know, he was not the Barack Obama we know today. He was a locally elected official in Chicago. And as his career ascended, he and I built a good relationship and partnership. And I was recruited to run tech and media policy for his first presidential campaign. That went well, and it went well at Hillary Clinton's expense. And so when she was asked to be Secretary of State, she said, "Hey, buddy, you know, you and your gang helped contribute to my defeat by, figuring out how to use innovation in the context of a presidential campaign. Come work for me. You make up your own title. Mm-hmm. Do whatever you want. Work at my elbow." And so I worked with her for 4 years, really focused at the intersection of national security and technology. So things like stopping surgical political assassinations in Syria because of, being able to identify targets from the GPS on their mobile phone, or trying to reduce the influence of the narcotics cartels in northern Mexico by creating encrypted, anonymized crime reporting. And so I did that for 4 years. It was great work. And what I've done since then is really advising startups and writing this book, The Industries of the Future. That's what I've been up to.
Quite a bit going on there. And on the book, I mean, I'm a big fan. I've read it a number of times and listened to the audiobook version of it countless times on the train as well. And, it covers everything emerging technology and innovation that people need to be thinking about, such as whether it's AI, machine learning, genomic sequencing, blockchain. You go into the weaponization of code, big data, and what you call the not-so-sharing economy, among other areas. But you also go one step further. You don't just tell us what's happening, but you explore the political, economic, and social implications of these innovations and what the opportunities are, whether it's for leaders of countries, whether it's for decision makers at companies and individuals, in terms of how they can position themselves to take advantage of these changes rather than be left behind. So there's so many different things that I could explore, but in the interest of time, I had to be very careful about how I picked my poison. And you touched on something as you were telling us about your career trajectory, about your teaching in Baltimore. And I know that more recently, Baltimore City Schools laid off 1,000 employees in an effort to close the $130 million budget deficit. Which is going to mean that we're going to go from 35 to 40 students in a class, perhaps to 45 or even 50. So I'm keen to explore that. And I know this is a topic that you're quite personally sort of associated with. I know you've got kids in the public school system in Baltimore. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this. And does this just represent an increase in the divide between Western America, say the states such as California, which is the fifth largest economy in the world, and the Middle America? So your Democratic voters and your predominantly Republican voters.
Yeah, all this work that I've done, from the White House Situation Room to, inner city, very poor classrooms, has made me come to a singular conclusion. And that is that talent is universally distributed, but opportunity is not. I know there were kids who I grew up with in coal country, and I know there were students who I taught in West Baltimore in an overcrowded classroom that are made of the same stuff as the people who sat across the table from me in the White House Situation Room. But when we do squeeze 35 and 40 students into a classroom, when we do have materials and conditions that really work against these students, it makes it impossible for them to compete with wealthy kids who go to these lovely schools with 10 students in a classroom and an infinite amount of teaching resources. Now, I'm a capitalist. I'm no socialist. I believe in the virtue and value of capitalism. So I'm not saying, let's, go tax the rich at 50 and 55% of their earnings. What I'm saying is that we need to systematically reduce some of the structural barriers to create more opportunity for these brilliant kids, growing up in poor rural and urban environments. And if we're going to pick our places to invest, let's say we don't want to tax ourselves to death, and I don't want to tax ourselves to death. But if we are going to pick a place to be strategic, where our tax dollars are going to create a high return on investment, it's got to be in education. We've got to get, more and better teachers in the classroom. We've got to reduce class sizes. We have to modernize the curriculum that we're teaching. Otherwise, what we're going to see is more inequality, and we're going to see more anger from urban blacks, from rural whites, from anybody who is trying to make it in the economy, but stagnating. There's an absolute ton of money to be made in the industries of the future, a ton of money to be made. And the question is will there be something close to a level playing field so that everybody can compete and succeed in that world?
And I imagine you'd find it quite unsettling that, Donald Trump's rhetoric seems to be focused on bringing 20th century manufacturing jobs back to the Rust Belt instead of preparing today's people and especially today's kids for the industries of the future.
Donald Trump is an idiot. I mean, this guy, look, I'm perfectly capable of being diplomatic, but he's crossed the line for, deserving respect. And putting some of his vulgarities aside that relate to how he treats people who weren't born on third base and look like he does. His economic policies are completely regressive. Now, he will do things that I believe will create increased valuations in the stock market. A repatriation of American tax dollars, bringing $2 trillion from foreign banks back to the United States, not subject to taxation. Those $2 trillion are going to go right to balance sheets. So it won't surprise me if we see an additional 10 to 20% increase in our stock markets. I also think that our economy is too regulated, and he will take some of the regulations that he takes out will make businesses more valuable. But at the end of the day, for everything he does to stimulate the economy, he does something else that over the intermediate to long term will hamper it. It's kind of like getting a sugar high. He's feeding the economy sugar instead of, proper proteins. And things like pretending that you can reverse globalization, pretending that Baltimore can suddenly be on par with Bangalore in terms of the ability to do low-cost manufacturing. I mean, it's anti-economic. He's out of his bloody mind.
And I know that you've said that reversing globalization, essentially, if you are to be competitive in this new age, then collaborating with other countries, being more open, whether you're an open government or whether you're just an open country that is codependent on other countries to succeed. I mean, that's essentially where we're going rather than closing our borders.
I think the principal political and economic binary of the 20th century was left versus right. But I think it's much more accurate to say that today, the principal political and economic binary isn't left versus right, it's open versus closed. And I mean that broadly. I don't mean open immigrate. Don't just mean things like free trade and the free flow of people and capital. Open also means that upward economic and social mobility is not constrained to elites. It means that cultural and religious norms are not set by central authorities. And it means that we are rights respecting. We're respecting the rights of women, of sexual minorities, of racial and ethnic minorities. And I do think that the states and societies that are more open will be the centers of innovation and wealth creation. And as I've traveled the world, and I've traveled to more than 100 of the world's 196 countries, I do think that whether you're in Shanghai or San Francisco or Sydney or London or Tel Aviv, I do think that there's some common cultural characteristics for among entrepreneurs, and they tilt toward openness.
Yeah, and I know in an article in I think it was Jabatical, you said that government can create conditions that either accelerate the work of entrepreneurs or fuck over entrepreneurs. And as somebody who has tried selling education into government or tried partnering with government for distribution, we're often met with the whole "we can't support you because you're not a not-for-profit" rhetoric. Um,
That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
yeah. I mean, what examples have you seen of countries that are, I suppose, more entrepreneur friendly and have, public policies that support entrepreneurship as opposed to those that are not so friendly? And what have the results of that been? I mean, obviously the US is a great case study of that, but what else have you seen?
Well, I don't think the United States does it perfectly, but it does certain things well.
Hmm.
I think the most important thing is for people in governments to view themselves as it being their job to help business succeed
Mm.
rather than to regulate business. So that guy in the government office in the white shirt and the red tie and the gray suit, when he thinks about his job,
Hmm.
does he say to himself, I'm here to try to help make business easy and successful? Or am I here to regulate it? Am
Yeah.
I here to, keep them coloring inside the lines? Uh, I really think that government needs to facilitate
Mm.
entrepreneurship and
Yeah.
view themselves as working for government rather than regulating it.
And it sounds like that's a framing thing where a lot of people that perhaps work in government see their work as a process as opposed to facilitating some positive outcome.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, if a lot of the time, if an entrepreneur comes to somebody in government and they have a solution to a problem,
Mm.
the person in government will respond with process.
Mm.
They'll say, oh, well, we'll see, you need to have these 14 things to be eligible to participate in the tender, and the tender will take 9 months. And, it goes not to the best product, it goes to the product that costs the least. Well, I got news for you. When I think about what I want to have for dinner, I don't go into the grocery store and say what dinner will cost the least
Yeah.
to make.
Yeah.
If I'm going to shop for a shirt, thank goodness I'm not, in coal country anymore. I don't have to say, all right, I'm going to buy the shirt that costs the least.
Mm.
You want to get something that is at the intersection of quality and value. But the way that government procurement works is oftentimes the opposite of that.
Mm.
It's backwards.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And on education, you mentioned that's one of the key areas we should be investing. And something like 80% of Americans were involved in agriculture or were farmers at the start of the 20th century. That number today is something like 2%. People moved on with every wave of innovation. New jobs tend to be created to replace the old. At least that's been the story until now. However, the gap between labor productivity and compensation, it seems to be getting bigger. And I guess I'm keen to hear your thoughts on whether this is a result of, one, greater automation and technology improving labor efficiency, and or I guess particularly in Middle America, people not being readied for this brave new world, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, you know, we haven't seen the massive increases in productivity, in part because we measure productivity in a fairly regressive way.
Mm.
If you think about a Google search, for example, you suddenly have access to not all of the world's knowledge, but a lot of it. But if information retrieval, being able to use the internet to get information in a few clicks in what would have once taken a half day to go to a library and pull books off a shelf and get perhaps, old dated information. The fact that that is not counted in productivity statistics says to me in part that the way the econometrics of decades ago don't work as well in the context of today and tomorrow's economy. So I have this sort of cranky academic critique of how we measure productivity. But beyond that, it is absolutely true that we have a mismatch between the skills that we have in the labor force and the areas of job growth. And so I've got these 7 companies that I have equity in and that I advise. and we're killing ourselves to find people with the skills to fill hundreds of openings. We will pay a 23-year-old $110,000 a year. He, can meet our computer science test. So there are lots of jobs out there, but what we have is a skills deficit more often than not. And when you're going from an industrial-based economy to an information-based economy, it's difficult to transform our human capital. Humans are not as easy to update as software.
Yeah.
So we're in this really tricky position right now where people are getting into their middle ages, in their 40s and in their 50s in particular. And if their jobs are being automated, the reskilling, telling a 52-year-old man who's been working in the same field for 30 years, hey, go learn how to computer code. That's a deeply dissatisfying proposition. So this is a difficult conversion. I ultimately come out more positive than negative, and more hopeful than scared. But I do think but my views are well short of utopian. I think that the changes in the economy driven by technology contribute to both the promise and peril of the future. It's going to be good for most of us, but it's going to be bad for a significant number.
On that balance between utopia and dystopia, briefly touched on automation, and I think in your book you touch on things like Skynet and whether we see these dystopian societies that were made famous by Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2 coming to light. But some people are on one side of that equation saying, look, artificial intelligence, blockchain is just going to create immense wealth for humanity, and therefore we're going to, live in the most prosperous times ever. The other side of that equation is people saying, well, once we hit singularity, where artificial intelligence is essentially smarter than the collective intelligence of humanity, it will turn on us. And then there's others who say, well, we'll use AI to essentially augment ourselves, and we'll have this great sort of harmony between technology and humanity. Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the Star Trek or Mad Max question. Is the future going to look more like Star Trek or more like Mad Max? I tend to take the view that artificial intelligence is something that we will use to augment human activity. There'll be certain kinds of labor that are eaten by artificial intelligence. It's inevitable. Work that is manual and routine, and increasingly cognitive and non-routine. There are certain kinds of jobs that will be eaten by software, in the same way in which the gentleman who would deliver blocks of ice, found his job eliminated by freezers. This is the upward march of technology and humanity. But where I see the principal relationship between artificial intelligence and humanity is as an augmentation to humans. In the future, the most important question in part will be, when you go to work, are you telling a machine what to do, or is a machine telling you what to do? And I think there's almost going to be a line between the workers who are telling the machines what to do and the workers who the machines are telling what to do. And what I hope is that we can skill our workforce in a way where humans remain dominant over machines.
I guess that then lends itself to funds like OpenAI, the non-profit organization set up by Elon Musk and other tech entrepreneurs, worth about $1 billion, which is serving the purpose of making sure that happens, where humans essentially stay in control of the technology.
This is a great initiative. So the people behind OpenAI, in addition to Elon Musk, there's another entrepreneur who I like very much named Reid Hoffman, who's one of the founding members of this. They put real money behind it. $1 billion is a ton of money.
Yeah.
And I like the intent here. I mean, the intent here is to develop artificial intelligence for good, to create some moral and ethical boundaries and governance around AI. I think it was actually very, I can be critical of the tech guys, and I self-identify as one of them. But I can be self-critical sometimes where I say, you know what, we sometimes think that whatever we build ought not be scrutinized um, from a sociological perspective, a psychological perspective, or a moral and ethical perspective. And what I like that Elon Musk and Reid Hoffman and others have done here, and maybe it's just, their wisdom has caught up with their intelligence, is by saying, you know what, let's create some structures to help make sure that we're doing AI for good.
I think it's definitely something that people should be addressing, and it's good to see that people who have such influence in the world, such as Reid Hoffman and Elon Musk, are taking it into their own hands, because it's something I'm not convinced government would be able to respond to quickly enough. And that's
You're right.
Yeah, and that's a
You're
whole
right.
different story.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a government basher. I had a great 4-year run in government. I think that, there are a lot of incredibly capable public servants.
Of course.
But this is a case of, the understanding and the skills of people in government don't necessarily lend themselves to evaluating a technology that is changing so quickly. And so I think that it's very good for people in the private sector, the Elon Musks and Reid Hoffmans of the world, to step forward and exert leadership from business. I think that's entirely positive.
What you've just said there about the technology moving faster than government can respond essentially lends itself to a lot of different industries outside of government, whether it's the university education system, where we have 4-year degrees and people learn stuff that's almost redundant by the time they get their piece of paper. We see that now in legal services. National Public Radio published a report which found that paralegals, for example, face up to 95% chance of being completely automated. Even professions such as financial accounting, financial audit face something like a 93% chance of being automated. So we're moving way beyond the blue collar jobs purely being automated. The 3.5 million odd truck drivers on the roads all becoming self-driving cars, but we're looking at white-collar jobs that people have gone to university for 5 or 6 years for, and then spent maybe 10, 15 years climbing up the ranks to make it to partner, only to find that, hey, my M&A firm's being replaced by computers. So what are your thoughts on that sort of evolution?
Yeah. So this is a non-theoretical for me. I mean, my mother, who's now retired, but my mother was a paralegal. That's one of the professions that you cited, and her job was automated. Yep. Now, her job should have been automated. I mean, her job before working as a paralegal was to go into the courthouse and go into where the records were stored, and she'd go in and these enormous, like 15-pound books off the shelves, and she would sort of finger through the pages of these books to make sure that there was going to be a clear transfer of sale when somebody bought or sold a home. Now, it's just ridiculous for that to not be done by computers. Yeah. And it now is done by computers, and the kind of work that would have taken my mother hours to do and cost hundreds of dollars now takes no time to do, and costs near nothing. So I do think that there are a lot of kinds of jobs, those that you mentioned, that are going to be eaten by software, that are going to be eaten by blockchain technologies. And at the core, it's all about intermediation. If you are a middleman, yep. If you are standing between a buyer and a seller, you are friction and you are expensive. And those are the positions that I think are increasingly going to be eliminated, especially if you're mediocre. So let's talk about a financial planner, for example. The person who you sit down with, who counsels you about how to spend your money. I think that there will always be room for people who are especially skilled at that. Who can deal with complexity and problem solving and really be able to not just talk but also listen. Mm-hmm. But that's only a certain percentage of financial planners. A lot of financial planners who are just sort of doing rote work, who